What does your reporting say about the impeachment process? What might your reporting say about the motives of Donald Trump?
Well, what our reporting did is it provided a very key but sort of basic point about the entire saga. The simple fact of when the president knew about the whistleblowers complaint to sort of help fill out the larger picture of the information the president had when he made one of these crucial decisions. And the point that we had uncovered was important to us because we didn't think that the folks on Capitol Hill that have been doing the impeachment proceedings had actually gotten to that in the course of all of their investigation. They've spoke to all these witnesses. They've only gotten so many documents. The White House has blocked them from talking to those people closest to the president, the exact people who could answer the basic questions of what the president knew. When was he briefed? Why did he decide to do the things that he did? So while on the face of it, not the biggest fact on the face of the earth, not the biggest thing, but something substantial that fills out the larger picture, that chips away to give us a better understanding of everything that he knew when he made these decisions that are now at the center of the impeachment investigation.
Hey, Kimberly, let's talk about Will Hurd, the low-talking, retiring Republican member of Congress from Texas who really became for a brief while there the favorite Republican of so many very hopeful Democrats. He notably and publicly said about a week ago that he hadn't seen enough evidence or evidence yet of bribery or extortion. Does reporting like this get a guy like Will Hurd, and that's one Republican, closer?
I think we'll have to see. I mean, one thing that we are seeing is public opinion seems to be growing stronger in support of this impeachment hearing. And that's something that a lot of Republicans, not Congressman Hurd because he is leaving, but a lot of Republicans should have in mind when they consider what rises to the level of bribery in their eyes. The Democrats clearly have laid out a case that is only supported by this latest reporting by Michael and the other folks at the Times that Donald Trump did this and ultimately gave this aid after he essentially got caught, in the words of Congressman Schiff. And it takes away a key defense of Republicans who say, look, there's no foul here. He gave the aid. There was never any announcement of any investigation, nothing to see here. We're learning facts that really cast doubt on that defense. So it's becoming more difficult for Republicans. But if they believe that they have the support of their constituents and the support of the president, so far that's been enough for them to be solidly behind him.
Jeremy Bash, in plain English, with guys like Mike Schmidt out there, we're learning new things every day, and yet the train is coming down the tracks. To mix my metaphors, the calendar is owned and run by the Democrats. Is this going to be a problem? Are you going to have various addenda coming late to the floor while this is being debated?
I think we may learn additional facts that strengthen the case. But I do not think we're going to learn new facts that weaken it. I think if the president had any exculpatory evidence, he would have put it forward. He would have insisted that the information that he has be put out there. But there is no substantive defense of the case. I think in some respects, it's case closed. The evidence is in. The testimony has been received. Yeah, we might hear from John Bolton down the road or some additional witness. But for the most part, the factual predicate is there. It's now really a legal issue, a constitutional issue, as to whether or not this body of facts constitutes bribery, treason, or a high crime and misdemeanor.
Mike, talk about the conflict in the White House counsel's office that was going on during the time period of your reporting tonight.
Well, the White House counsel's office was trying to figure out whether the administration had to hand over the whistleblower's complaint to Congress. The whistleblower had come forward to the Inspector General for the intelligence community, and the Inspector General wanted to give that document to Congress, but the White House counsel's office thought that there may be some executive privilege issues. This was a highly unusual situation because you had someone coming forward complaining about the president, and the president has these powers, or, people think the president has these powers to protect certain information from going out the door. And they were asking and talking talking to the president about how they were going to ask the Justice Department for an opinion on whether they had to do this. Now, the Justice Department ultimately came back and said that they did not have to hand this document over, and it was only under pressure that this thing actually came out. So it's unclear sort of how this actually fed into what the president was thinking, because after he was briefed on it at the end of August, he may have thought, certainly in early September, that it may not come out and it may not go to Congress. And obviously, it is on the 11th, September 11th, that the aid is ultimately released. And at that point, Congress knows about the complaint, and we learn about more detail about that shortly thereafter.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.